Hi, Phil. Welcome to the show. And thank you very much for your time. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. And thank you so much for inviting me on your show. I was really looking forward to this conversation.
Why don't you give us a little bit background about yourself and introduce yourself to our audience, where you come from, what you do, and we go from there.
Absolutely. So my name's Phil Silverstein, and I'm a principal at Moriama Tashima Architects. We're located in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. We also have an office in Ottawa. And I've been with the firm for a little over 20. Oh, this is my 24th year. My goodness.
You look much younger. For those of people who cannot see you, you look much younger.
Well, I started when I was 3.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, I've been here for about 24 years, a little over 26 years in the industry, and I just haven't looked back. The firm has always had such rewarding, wonderful projects, that the ones that really inspire us, inspire good design, and so it's really kept me inspired at doing what I love to do.
You and I met on a site visit on a mass timber project that belongs to George Brown College in Toronto, downtown, close to the water. And aside from the fact that I probably freaked you out with all the questions that I asked you that day on site, you had this glow and energy and excitement when talking about that project. And I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to extend that saying probably it had to do with the fact that it was mass timber and was unique and was one of a kind. Where does that passion come from? Where does that your involvement with the green buildings or high performance buildings, where does it come from? Was it just a casual choice, or did something else happen?
I think something else happened. I was born with it. I have to.
Okay.
So I grew up in suburban London, Ontario. It's a bit of a cultural void, social void. It's just a bunch of homes surrounded by nothing else than other homes. But I had the fortune as a young child at the age of 6 to go to our summer camp. So I was gone for a month, 2 months in the summer. And I learned as a young child, there's a connection, a deep connection to nature, a respect for nature. And also growing up in suburban London, as a young child, a mall was built nearby when I was a young teen. And that completely changed everything about my life in suburbia. I could now walk to a grocery store. We had a social gathering place where friends could go. So I knew from a young age that architecture, even though London isn't known to be a hotbed of progressive design, but something as simple as a mall completely changed my life and my social life. And the impact of what a building can do to you as a human, to us culturally and socially, had an early impact on me. But I also knew the buildings are degenerative. To build a building, it takes natural resources, it takes energy. And most of that building material that you're using comes from the ground as a natural resource, and it's somewhat destructive. And it bothered me. So I wanted to get into architecture. I knew I had a passion for it from a young age as a child, but I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to design buildings that changed the carbon story, that changed how we look at building, how we look at designing, and how we look at constructing. And I found that place at Moriama Tashima. It didn't start that way. The firm had its roots in regenerative design somewhat in some of our early projects. Raymond Moriama set up some pretty remarkable guiding principles that we still follow to this day. And we've just taken it to new levels.
You touched on something that I want to try and expand on. You said there's a whole thing about the importance of the building, but also the importance of the way we build the building. And in this particular case that we're going to dive deep into today, the mass timber and the fact that you just mentioned that, like, typically when we build a building, we use a lot of material, and in some way, shape, or form, we are damaging the environment, and we have been for thousands of years. And this notion that mass timber is the panacea or the silver bullet of, like, okay, now we can all of a sudden fix this. And if we do something with mass timber, it's going to be green as green can be. I have to admit that I've been suspicious of this notion for the past couple of years, at least, that I've been looking at it. I'm currently privileged enough to be working on one of these projects. But I would still like to know why you think mass timber is actually good, because if I want to put it in layman's term, we're still cutting trees to build the
Hmm.
buildings. And I was always taught in the school that the trees are the lungs of our planet. How does that logic work?
Right. Well, let's spend the next 10 hours talking about this. Well, should I explain what mass timber is to start with?
Sure,
Because
by
I
all
think there's
means.
people
Yeah.
listening that they think mass timber, they hear the word timber, they think stick frame.
Yeah.
And it's 2x4s. It's small pieces of wood that are glued or nailed together to create beams, columns, and floor panels or wall panels. It's really that simple. So you're taking small pieces of wood to create large pieces of wood, and there are benefits to that. It's that product ends up being as close to the same structural properties as steel or concrete. It has inherent fire resistant properties to it, and it's beautiful and it smells great. So mass timber, and it's good to be suspicious of these things. We have to be, because mass timber, first of all, it's green because it grows. The stuff
Right.
grows on trees. It's wood. You can regenerate a forest. A lot of the wood that we're extracting from forests is from second growth forests, where those trees were planted 60 years ago. We've cut them. We're using it in our building. And now we're replanting those forests. In 60 years, you're going to harvest that wood. Until concrete or steel grow on trees, you can't say that about those. But you're cutting trees. And I was suspicious
Right.
about that too. When I first heard of this, I mean, I'm a tree hugger. I hug a lot of trees, and I don't want to cut these down. But if it's done sustainably, if you have a sustainable forest and you manage it sustainably, the forest regrows, the carbon cycle continues. What you don't want to extract trees from a forest that you know are becoming ecological wastelands where there's monoculture. If you're going to plant new trees that are single species, it is void of nature. It's actually kind of creepy being in those forests. There are no birds. There's very little animal life. They're wastelands.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we don't want. Now, we're in Canada, we have a lot of sustainable forests. In fact, all of our forests are sustainably managed. There are very few that aren't, and that might be maybe in private lands, but publicly publicly owned lands are sustainably managed, and we have a great record of that in Canada. There's a lot of the European forests are also very sustainably managed, and most regions of the United States, even South America, China, Australia, there's a lot of sustainably managed forest that, and the forest managers are out there trying to educate people about what it means about sustainable forests. You in Canada, when we remove trees from a forest, decades of studies have to be done to analyze the animal populations, the reptilial, the mammal, the bird populations, the erosion that will happen from it. There's a lot of measures that go in, and you have to prove that after you've harvested the forest, how are you going to replenish it? How are you going to, first of all, how are you going to extract in a way that maybe mimics a natural forest fire? And then how are you going to replant the way nature would replant? To reduce erosion, to bring back those animals and you're planting native species. So, the other thing is, you asked me how you're cutting down trees, how is it sustainable? We've worked on maybe over 30 or 40 LEED certified buildings. They're all concrete or steel. And no one ever said to us when they walked in those buildings, you're calling this a sustainable building. You just achieved LEED gold, but you're using concrete or you're using steel.
Mm-hmm.
So we never make that comparison with steel or
True.
concrete. Now we have a wood building, and they're asking, how is this sustainable? We get that question a lot, and I've never had that question in my career about a concrete or steel building.
That's a very fair point. But from the other perspective, I guess no one is also claiming that concrete is clean the way we're claiming the wood is clean,
Right.
for the environment.
Right.
And I do get the logic. Don't get me wrong, I understand the logic, but it almost feels a little bit counterintuitive. But like you explain it, yes, that makes sense if you're regrowing the same trees. And like you mentioned, we're using the trees that were basically planted for this purpose 60 years ago, which I guess would mean that you would want to make sure that what you're purchasing, the wood you're purchasing, the sources are certified, they have proper regulation or authorities checking them out. And as long as that system is working and is doing what's supposed to be doing, I guess you have comfort in knowing that what you're doing is actually good for the environment, right?
That's right. You want your trees to be FSC certified, Forest Stewardship Council. If it's FSC certified, it's coming from a certified forest, a sustainably managed forest.
Gotcha.
The other aspect of it in terms of sustainability is the sequestering nature of the timber. So there's two areas of carbon that we talk about. There's the embodied carbon and the sequestered carbon.
Okay, maybe
And
walk us through that.
sure. So let's talk about the sequestered carbon. So a tree, if you look at the volume of a tree, where does it get that volume from? A lot of people misunderstand that they think it comes from the ground, from the roots. It's pulling nutrients from the ground. Well, it is, but the vast majority of the volume of a tree, the mass of that tree, comes from the air that it breathes. The process of photosynthesis pulls the oxygen or the carbon dioxide from the air. It removes the carbon and sequesters it into the tree. And then it breathes off the oxygen. It's the process of photosynthesis that we've all learned as children. That's the building block of the tree, and that's where it gets its volume from. So essentially, a tree becomes a carbon sink. Mm-hmm. And so that's sequestered carbon. It's carbon stored in the tree. So when you extract that tree from the forest, you've now locked in that carbon. You've locked it into your building. And if you're designing a durable building that's going to last, say, 100, 200 years, you've now captured that for the 100 to 200 years. So that's the sequestered carbon. Now there's the embodied carbon, and that's the energy it takes to actually extract, produce, fabricate, and bring that material to site and then install it. So when I say carbon, I'm talking about carbon dioxide. That's the man-made fossil fuels that are burnt. It's the leading cause of global warming.
Right.
So we want to reduce carbon. We want to reduce carbon dioxide. So you want to choose materials in a building that you can extract with the least amount of energy, that you can bring to site with the least amount of energy and construct.
What I'm gathering is that the regenerative nature of mass timber and the fact that you're not removing something that was doing something good. Basically, you're just replacing it. Obviously, there's a lag in place. That is helping on a very big portion with what we need to do in this planet to make the air cleaner, gather the carbon dioxide and bring it in. And I don't know if you know this, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but does it make a difference? Like if it's, do the older trees gather more carbon from environment than the younger trees, or do you know any numbers? I'm sure there's some, we can look it up.
You want to talk to someone like Ann Colvin from U of T, who could give a really wonderful, you should bring her on one of your podcasts. But I can give you an answer that I believe to be true. The young trees in the early stages of a tree's life, maybe the first 40 to 60 years, it's when it's the highest carbon sequestering moment of its life, when it's doing the most amount of growing. Old trees don't grow much more. They're not adding a lot of mass to their overall structure, so they're not sequestering a lot of carbon. But they're to a forest.
That's where I was going with this. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. That's where I was going with this, because when I think about the 60-year period that we were mentioning, it almost seems like, okay, someone has probably smarter than me has figured this out before, that there's a sweet spot. Like it probably around the 60-year mark or something like that, the marginal benefit starts dropping and you don't get as much growth in the tree. So let's cut it at that point. I'm assuming that's logic.
That's right. Yeah. So 60 years is actually a young tree. And when I say 60, we're talking about Northern Ontario, Northern Quebec. Trees grow very slow there. It takes 60 years to get to the point where you want to harvest that and create a mass timber panel. Actually, a lot of those trees aren't cut for mass timber. Most of them are cut for pulp and paper and dimensional framing. So mass timber is a very small, tiny little fraction. But the large trees do play a vital role in forest health. There's a lot of biodiversity happening under the ground in the root systems. And the trees are talking to each other and they're integrated with the microbes in the ground. And those big trees, the big granddaddies of the forest, we're not extracting those. No one's going into rainforest and cutting those big trees. You're not going into California and cutting the giant redwoods. We're cutting younger trees, and you're cutting trees. And a lot of the trees aren't even cut. The forest fires in Quebec that we had last year, Nordique out of northern Quebec went in immediately after the fires, because the fires leave the main trunks. They burn the branches and the leaves. The insects will infest those pretty quick. So Nordique went in right away, extracted those trees, and used them for mass timber.
Oh,
And
interesting.
it's actually quite beautiful, the product they're able to create from that. Now, by extracting those trees, it meant that you didn't have that rotting in the ground, drying out potential future fire hazards.
Right. That's actually really interesting. Opportunities, unfortunate opportunities, but opportunities
Mhm.
nevertheless, right? And I want to switch gear a little bit. First of all, I very much enjoyed that grandparent trees and the trees speaking to each other. I've never thought about it that way. But I want to switch gears a little bit and go to what you said very early on in our conversation about the impacts of a building on the society around them. And I want to circle that and tie that into George Brown College. George Brown College, the Limberlost project, which you've been intimately involved in, qualifies for having had an impact on how we look at mass timber, at least in the city of Toronto. And I want to see what your take is on it. Why was that project important?
It's a game changer. So Limberlost Place, George Brown College. First of all, it's called Limberlost Place because Jack Hockwell donated a large sum of money. He's the major donor. He didn't want to name it after himself. He named it after his forest preserve that he owns just south of Algonquin Park. So it's
Right.
called the Limberlost Forest. That's why we're calling it Limberlost Place. Limberlost Place is a game changer. It's a demonstration project. It's one of a kind that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And it is the innovation in this project is absolutely astounding. So we can start with the impact, the structural innovation. This project is a 10-story mass timber structure located on Toronto's waterfront. It's in an area where we have very tight zoning restrictions. We would probably only fit a 9-story building in, but we wanted a 10-story building in order to get government funding towards research in CLT design. And so our structural engineers, Fast and Neck out of Vancouver, designed a flat panel beamless system. This had never been done before. There's no proof of concept. They had never done anything like this before, but they were boring concepts that you often see in concrete construction parking garages with drop panels.
True.
So they engineered a system. This environment, the Natural Resources NRCan donated money or granted money to George Brown College to go to all the soft costs. And we developed a system that is now tested to failure that actually helped reduce the overall building height to allow us to sneak in that additional floor by removing the beams.
Interesting.
And that's important because those beams take up headspace. The beams are complicated to get mechanical elements through them or under them. By eliminating the beams, you give that space back to the students. You can open up the ceilings and create a higher floor to floor without having impacted those deep beams. So that was a really interesting structural innovation. And it's actually won quite a few awards at this point. And Robert Jackson, the engineer who developed this, has been on the world circuit talking about this innovation. Another thing is that makes this project so important is it's one of the very first projects in Toronto to meet the Toronto Green Standard Tier 4.
Mm-hmm.
I believe when we designed it, there were no projects that met that standard. The Toronto Green Standard Tier 4 it's a standard that really focuses on net zero emissions. And by that, I mean, there's no gas-fired appliances in our building. You can't leave anything on the table. It's like meeting LEED Platinum on steroids. And in order to meet the standard, we had to reduce the operating energy as much as we possibly could. You do that through passive house design with your building envelope. We brought in district heating and cooling from the OnWave system. It was actually the first building in Toronto that tapped into OnWave's heating side of the plant. We're using really simple passive technologies like daylight harvesting, rainwater harvesting. We have solar PV panels on the roof. The building is designed as a purposeful built where every design element is purposeful. There are very few elements in the building that are there for flourish or just for aesthetic impact. The glass fins on the north face of the building are there because the Toronto grid is a little bit off north-south direction and there was heat gain on the north facade. The shape of the building has a sloped roof, and that's in order to allow the natural ventilation system to get those outlets as high as possible to draw the air through the solar chimneys, which maybe we have time to talk about that later. We raised the windows as high as they could go. The windows are floor to ceiling, but narrow. So we looked at the window to wall ratio, a 60-40 window to wall ratio, but the height of the windows allowed us to flood the building with natural daylighting, meaning we can shut the lights off during the day. And when it gets dark, the lights slowly dim up until all the lights are on in the room. So we're able to reduce our operating energy. We have very few outlets in the building. We're expecting students to come with fully charged devices. We'll have portable battery charging stations throughout the building that we charge at nighttime, so we're not drawing the energy during the day. The list goes on. There's a lot happening there to meet the Toronto Green Standard Tier 4. Now, what's interesting about that is back in 2018, when we designed this building, Toronto Green Standard Tier 4 was the highest standard, but it will be Tier 1 in 2030. So what we were doing in 2018, the innovation is what every building needs to be doing by 2030. So we're setting that trend. We're setting those targets. We're showing the industry what you need to do. It sounds intimidating, maybe, that's going on. When you walk through the building with me and I'm talking about all the innovation, it's like, how could any other developer do this? Well, we have in other buildings where we didn't have to jump through hoops. One example is OSSTF project, Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation. So this is a project that meets almost the exact same targets as Limberlost, but it's an office building. It's a building that was the key aspect of this is we want to build a building that is highly sustainable, both environmentally sustainable and financially sustainable. We're beholden to our 60,000 members across Ontario, and every dollar we spend has to be accounted for. We still got a mass timber structure meeting almost the exact same targets as Limberlost. Number one aspect of Limberlost Place that I think is the biggest game changer is the impact it has to the culture of the people in the building. So we're all accustomed to living and working in hermetically sealed buildings, completely separate from the outdoor environment. We live in air-conditioned spaces. We live in heated spaces. Well, of course we have to. That's how we find comfort. Well, you wouldn't come to work if it was a different way. But we have windows that are closed and hermetically sealed, and we have no control over our spaces. We expect building automation systems to control it for us. And at Limberlost, we wanted to open that up. We have a lot of passive systems like the natural ventilation system, where faculty will go and open a window when it's a decent day to do so. And you're wondering, when do they know it's a good day? What if it's raining outside? What if it's snowing? Well, they can. Sometimes in the middle of winter, you might want a window open, but it's a highly sophisticated building. We have weather stations on the roof that say that we're analyzing the air temperature, the humidity, the air quality, the wind speed. And if it says it's a good time to open your windows, which would probably end up being around 40% of the year, hopefully more, staff will get a notification on their phone saying, today's a good day to open your windows. There's digital boards throughout the building. The thermostats will be lit green saying so there's all these messages telling you to open your windows or to close them on a bad day. And if enough windows are open, the ERVs on each floor shut down. So instead of pumping ventilated air through the raised access floor into the space, those ventilators turn off and air comes in through the windows. But it has to get drawn through the building. You look at some old buildings from the turn of the century, a lot of older houses and older buildings built in Toronto, they're over 100 years old. They use natural ventilation. You have windows they're designed to allow air to flow through these buildings. You don't necessarily need air conditioning. But now we have to get back to that. We have to start designing all buildings in a way that don't have to rely on mechanical systems. That builds in resiliency too. That's a key aspect to I think sustainable architecture is resiliency, and it's something a lot of architects aren't looking into. It's a missing element in client requests for design, and if you aren't building for resiliency, then you're not building for the future. The climate's changing, how we use buildings are changing. Buildings may be, you'd think, at the end of their life, because people aren't using it the way they expected to, like a mall, for instance, or a condo. How do you make sure that you design a building that it can go from a condo into something else? The building I'm in right now was a warehouse. It's now an architect's office. Mm-hmm. Before us, it was a grocery store. Right. The building I'm in is a timber building, post and beam. There's no shear walls. So the floor plate is open and any tenant can move in and do whatever they want with it. In 50 years, we may or may not be here. We'll still be a firm, but we may not be in this building. And it may be a residence. Who knows? We need to start designing our buildings for that type of resiliency. George Brown is setting that standard. It's a post-secondary building housing the School of Architecture for George Brown. And in 30, 40 years from now, if they decide to move their campus off the waterfront, it'll be a condo and they can make it that.
Yeah, and I think going back to the whole impact of a building, I'm sure people who are studying there right now or are going to study there for decades to come are going to be impacted and affected by the feeling of that building. And I know even we had this discussion before on site that there's so many innovations that you guys incorporated in that project on different fronts that it will probably take us a couple of days to talk about all of them in detail. I do want to at some point come back and ask you about the solar chimneys that you guys created, because that was pretty neat and I found it very interesting. But before I go to that, just wrapping up the discussion about the importance of that project. I hear that when astronauts go to moon and come back, some of them, they get depressed because they've conquered what they thought would be the pinnacle of their career. You're not getting depressed, are you?
Oh God, no. It's the stuff we have in the pipeline is equally as exciting.
Can you maybe give us some idea? And that's where I was going to, because it almost feels that you exhausted everything you could at a time on George Brown College. What else is there?
Well, okay. So one thing that wasn't in our vocabulary back when we designed Limberlost in 2018 was the embodied carbon side of the equation of design. And that's a new element that is upfront in our design. Well, I talked about our embodied carbon earlier on in our conversation. And what this means to us is we're looking at every material we're bringing into our building. If we're selecting a brick, a metal siding, a flooring material, it doesn't matter what it is, we're looking at the embodied carbon. We, on the OSSTF project, that's the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, we went with triple glazing because triple glazing has a bit higher R value than double glazing. But we learned only after the fact that triple glazing has a much higher embodied carbon than we ever expected. And when you look at the carbon versus the money spent and the R value added, it actually doesn't really make sense. When you're looking at brick, for instance, you say we decide we're going to go with a white masonry unit. Is there one that's local? No. Do we have to import this from Europe? Do we really want to ship brick from Europe or Italy? That's high carbon. We should be looking at local materials that are closer to site, that have a lower embodied carbon getting here. So it's changed how we're designing. It's changing the materials that we're specifying. We're looking at this early on in projects. We're using a program called One-Click LCA to do this analysis. And it was the OSSTF project that really got us thinking about it, because Kelly Doran at the HAF Studio at U of T used it in a case study. And we were patting ourselves on the back. Like, look at us, we designed these highly sustainable buildings. The TEVI, TUI, and GHG are off the charts, great. But in terms of embodied carbon, we're one of the worst performing projects, mainly because we had a basement. Basements, you excavate down below ground, that's high carbon. You're putting tons of concrete in the ground, very high carbon. And there's other aspects that was part of the program. We could not do the parking garage on underground parking. But the other projects we're being compared to didn't have parking garages below grade. It's making us think about do we actually try to convince a client to not go below grade, or if we are, don't go so deep. When you ask what other projects in the pipeline, well, we've become what I would call, and we don't publicize this on our website or anything, but what I call a timber first company.
Yeah.
So when a project comes into the office, pre the mass timber world, our uptake of mass timber, the structural engineer would usually advise us what system makes the most sense. Now we're saying we're going to start with timber unless it doesn't make sense. Right. And we have a lot of projects in the office now that aren't timber. But now we have clients coming to us saying, I don't care what you say, we want a timber building. And one of them, which is really exciting, is the Toronto District School Board has brought us on to design the very first mass timber K to 8 mass timber public school in Scarborough on Poplar Road. And what's exciting about this is they want us to design it as a kit of parts, so that you could take the structural system and the whole bay that we developed and expand it in width and length and height, so that they could take that kit of parts and give it to any architect and say, you're going to be designing a school. This is your base size with these kit of parts, and expand it or contract it and grow it however you need to make this building. because that's where it becomes efficient. Mass timber is a prefabricated element. So it's quick, it's easy to install. And if you can create a kit of parts, it's even faster.
So the idea is to basically create massive pieces of Lego for architects to play
Yes,
with and form sustainable schools.
that's right. And we know there's a lot of studies out there. It's kind of a bit of voodoo science. It's hard to analyze the impacts of wood and the biophilic response that we have to wood. But we know that when you're in an environment surrounded by wood, you feel better. You just do. If you're in a space that's four walls of concrete or a space that's four walls of wood, you will feel different in that space.
Yeah.
Well, I shouldn't have said it's voodoo. I think we all know that. It's hard to prove it. It's hard to scientifically.
It's intangible.
Intangible.
Yes.
Exactly. That's the right word.
Yeah. It's more of a feeling thing, but you know what? There's definitely a place for it. I've walked those buildings with you and on other projects, and you even looking at your background, and I know everyone cannot see you, but even your background, you have exposed wood ceilings in your office. It gives you a different vibe than looking in HCTV acoustic tile for the flooring, for the ceiling. But yeah, that's definitely it. I do want to ask you, I heard one of your video clips, I don't know if it was on YouTube or on Instagram or where for your walkthrough on the George Brown College went viral, and it had like 20 million views or something. Is that
I
true?
wish I could repeat that again, but what a fluke that was.
Yeah,
that was an interesting event. So the Toronto Society of Architects wanted to tour Limberlost with about 200 other members. You can't bring 200 people on a construction site. Like we max out at around 10 per tour. So, and we just hit the 150 tour mark.
Wow,
that's a lot of tours.
That's a lot of tours.
Sorry, I'm gonna say back to one of the other questions about what makes George Brown so unique is that aspect. The fact that we're bringing city officials and people from the insurance industry, architects, our direct competition, we're bringing through the building. We want everyone to learn how to do these buildings. We want to spread the knowledge. There's no trade secrets anymore. We don't have 50 years for the whole industry to catch up. We need them to catch up tomorrow.
Pretty quickly,
So back to your question was about the viral video on YouTube. So Toronto Society of Architects said the compromise was, why don't we just bring a film crew through? We'll film it, and then we can distribute that to our members. So they did. It was maybe an hour-long tour, and they took a small little clip of me pointing to one of the columns. It's a glulam column. It's around 16 meters tall, about 2 meters by 800 millimeters. And I was just marveling at how magnificent it was. And it was maybe a 20-second clip. It got about 1.6 million views and thousands upon thousands of comments. But what it did is it was like the perfect sample of where all the misconceptions are in public knowledge and the disinformation. The things that stood out were sustainable. Like one of the first questions you asked me is, how can you call this sustainable? Lots of the questions were, you're cutting down trees, stop calling it sustainable, you're greenwashing it. The other questions were about fire. Well, it's a wood building, it's going to burn down. I'm sure some of these people saying that lived in 100-year-old wood-framed homes. They're not scared about their house burning down tomorrow. So it sort of gave us a list of items that we need to start messaging out to the public and things that we need to talk about.
And for everyone listening, I actually suggest you search that clip of Philip pointing to that column, because it is impressive. I stood by that column, and if I remember correctly, you had mentioned that you actually had to size the crane for the job to be big enough to be able to carry that column into place and hold it, because it was a significant column. But anyways,
22,000 pounds. Cranes can lift something 1,000 times heavier than that. But in this case, the crane was sized, and then they realized that they needed to up it a bit because this was the largest, heaviest lift on the job.
Gotcha.
One column.
Yeah, but that is heavy. Let's take a step further. Mm-hmm. We talked about why mass timber is important, why mass timber is critical, and how it can be considered green. We talked about how the project that you guys did is important, and it's going to leave its footprint. If it hasn't already, it will keep growing, that footprint and impact on the society as a whole. I want to see and start translating your takeaways from that project into a smaller scale. And by that, I mean, not everyone can afford and is willing to build another George Brown College with all the bells and whistles. And I'm sure a lot of our audience who listen to our show here are smaller developers, private developers that are curious to see what are the opportunities of this new thing called mass timber that is everywhere these days, and you hear about it all the time. And obviously, we just talked about all the benefits. What would you say some of the key takeaways that you would say to a residential developer, a mid-rise developer, someone who wants to build a 10-story building, 8-story building, 6-story building, and they could consider mass timber? I'm going to put in bracket that mass timber is slightly harder to make work with numbers still, as far as I know. But let's say they can make that work. What are the key takeaways that you would want them to know, or you think it's important for them to know to not make those mistakes?
Maybe the best way to answer this is to talk about a case study where we were working on a project that was actually a concrete residential project. It was a 9-story building and ended up being 12. So we were approached by a developer called Atria, and they're here in Toronto. They have a project in Oshawa. They purchased an old post office, a 2-story post office with concrete columns. And they had designed a concrete residential tower above it. They really liked the idea of mass timber. They didn't think they could afford it. They think they could rent the units for more because it's mass timber. They know they can build it faster. They can get this so they can open it sooner and start generating revenue faster. So we did a study. We rationalized the building. The thing about timber is it doesn't transfer loads that well. You need to add a lot of steel, and you have to do some magic and mysticism to make this thing work. Concrete and steel can't deliver well. So we rationalized the building, and it turned out that we were able to give them 3 additional floors without making major modifications to the columns below, to the existing columns and footings, because mass timber is 1/5 the weight of concrete. So it is so light.
Interesting.
They got 3 more stories. That makes the economics work.
Just so I understand correctly, so you were bound by the logistics of an existing building and the load-bearing capacity of the columns on that building. And what you're saying is that because you had to work with that, it wasn't like you were going to demo that. You had to keep that. And now, because the whole structure is much, much lighter, you actually can get more square footage.
Right. So if you can as a developer, if you can get 3 more stories out of your building without changing the existing structure, that changes the economic value, the economic proposition of that project. And so that leads me to where the benefits of this come in urban infill. You have a lot of downtown sites, let's say in Toronto, along streetcar lines and subway lines where you have 2-story buildings, 3-story buildings. We want to densify those. And let's not tear them down. If the building exists, we want to keep that. We want to keep that stored energy, the embodied carbon in that building, but we can build on top. And you can build on top much easier, much faster, maybe even more stories if it's a timber structure.
It's a very interesting thought because, to your point, we have a lot of buildings that are older, and just to have to tear them apart, go below grade, aside from the actual like environmental items that we just talked about, aside from that, but even the impact for the construction cost, the setup of the project, it's not easy. I've been involved in some of those projects in the past, and it's not easy having to work with existing elements. But at the same time, it could mean that you have a head start in the game when you start construction, at least in terms of cost and your exposure. And you're right. If we could find a way, going back to your example about the school system and putting together Legos, if we as a society, as an industry, were able to put together a Lego system that says, you know what, if you have a 2-story, you can probably reinforce it 10% and still get another 4-story on top, that could be a game changer. I would be very interested in learning more about that opportunity.
Yeah, it's happening a lot in Europe. They have a good decade ahead of us on that, but it's starting to happen here. This is, I wish I knew every mass timber project happening in Canada. I don't. As far as I know, this might be one of the only mass timber. We call it a 9/2. 9 stories of mass timber over 2. There's no, that's not true. The tall academic tower at U of T, it's a 14-story mass timber building, but I think I'm going to get this wrong, but I'm going to say that it's like maybe 8 stories in mass timber, or maybe 9 stories of mass timber on a concrete existing building. So we're starting to see that happening. But about the value proposition, you mentioned that it does cost more. And I think back when we started in 2018, the rule of thumb was mass timber will probably be a 10% premium over traditional construction. We're definitely seeing those numbers coming down. It's coming down because Limberlost, it was a workforce of six, a crew of six that built that building.
Mm-hmm.
Compare
Really?
that to a concrete structure. I
Wow.
think that a crane, what is it, 20 people
Yeah,
per
let's go
crane?
20. Yeah, that's true.
20 per crane is the
Yeah,
typical. So you have two
yeah,
cranes, you have 40 guys laying rebar. Six people built Limberlost. Three on the ground,
interesting.
three up, catching the slab and laying it. You're doing 15,000 square feet a week with mass timber.
That's
And once you
impressive.
lay that panel down on the floor, you're done. You carry on to the next building. But we're starting to see, and it's what I find really interesting is a lot of student housing and low income housing is going mass timber. These are buildings that have no budget. They they aren't going to be flashy and big, but they're going mass timber because those types of residential buildings are, we'll call it cookie cutter. You have same units, it's a rinse and repeat, same on every single floor. So it lends itself really well to mass timber because it's very rational. All of the elements are vertically aligned. And like there's a great project right now that's being built at U of T at Trinity College. And it's a student residence. The city of Toronto on Dundas near Ossington is proposing like a tall mass timber low income housing. Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, there's another one being built there. There's quite a few of them. And it's all these low income housing student residents that are going mass timber. And we have a project in Newfoundland. It's a steel structure. That's what the client wanted. We were really pushing mass timber. So we went through a long educational session trying to bring them up to speed on what it is about what mass timber is, how it works, what the pitfalls and constraints and risks are. I think that they've drank the Kool-Aid. And so we went out, we designed two buildings, a steel and a mass timber building. And guess what? Wood came in cheaper.
That's
And it
good.
came in cheaper because they have poor soils. The poor soils created very deep, heavy footings. The timber, like I said, is 1/5 the weight. It reduced the footings so substantially that it brought the whole building in cheaper than the steel structure.
Interesting. And I'm assuming you didn't have too much of a shallow groundwater table to push the building upward. Probably
right. like at Limberlost.
Yes, at Limberlost you had that, right? I guess if I want to just change gears a little bit, if you were to get involved in a bigger scale, let's say we had a magic wand here somehow and we would give Phil a magic wand and say, Phil, if you could change one law, one regulation, one guideline, one misconception, one thing that would make our society as a whole better when it comes to building better buildings, building more and greener buildings. Does anything come to mind?
That reminds me of a quote. And this may sound cheesy. Antonio Gaudi, this is something I remember hearing when I was a teenager in high school. He said, nothing is invented for it's written in nature first. Originality consists of returning to the origin. So you look at, we borrow from nature. If you borrow from nature, you look at the way nature works, the way it's adopted itself to its environment, then we've lost that principle. Back in, you go down to warm climates in the south, you go to Phoenix, you look at some of the old buildings there, you go to Europe, you go anywhere in the world, you look at indigenous architecture, they borrowed from nature. We've completely lost that. You look at our cities now, they all look the same. You look at a skyline in Houston, it looks like the skyline in Toronto, it looks like the skyline in Sydney. Completely different environments. They all look the same. They're all these glass towers hermetically sealed. And it would be so nice to get back to that. George Brown College, the Limberlost place, doesn't look like a typical Toronto building because it's purposeful. You're using passive technologies. We have natural ventilation and daylight harvesting, and it changes the look of a building. And it would be nice to get back to that, to start looking at those first principles.
So you would encourage everyone to go back and see what we used to do or what our ancestors used to do, because what I'm gathering, the theme of our conversation here has been basically at some point in time, we managed to conquer the elements so much but in so much effect that we basically locked it outside entirely and said, you know what, you're welcome, stay out. We don't want you to figure things out. But one of the interesting points that you mentioned was that now you're giving the staff in Limberlost the option of going out and open the window, right? Which is not a very common thing in most of the, at least commercial or office buildings in North America. You have these sealed glass boxes, and that's probably one of the things that people used to open windows for as long as Windows existed. And it's not until recently that it was the other way around, right?
Right.
So,
yeah, and you know what opening the window does is it means that the indoor environment is not going to be between 20 and 22 degrees all year round, spring, like all 4 seasons. There's going to be, you have to accept a wider temperature range. You have to accept that you might feel the air moving past you. That one space may feel slightly different than another space. And that's something that culturally we have to start getting used to. We can't put these extreme demands of these very narrow environmental conditions that you want to live in. We have to increase that breadth. So we have ceiling fans at Limberlost. The ceiling fans help bring that comfort zone up when the temperature gets too hot. And
it might be a good time to segue, sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
It might be a good way to segue into the solar chimneys. What's a solar chimney?
A solar chimney is a chimney, but it's using solar because we have heat shelves in the chimney, and the heat shelves heat up that space. It allow airs to rise through buoyancy and natural stack effect. So this is that's been used forever. Like I remember actually being in Cuba, and I was in this giant palapa. It was like their main reception, and it was open around the outside, like low opening around the outside, and then it was pyramid shaped with an opening up top. It didn't matter what time of day it was, in the blazing heat, the air would just move through those low openings and up through that opening at the top. TPs work the same way. Like there's so many examples of this type of architecture. So we're using that at Limberlost. This is a post-secondary 10-story tall building on Toronto's waterfront, and we're using that technology. The solar chimneys we have other buildings that you have similar innovations. The OSSTF building I talked about, there's a central atrium, and we're using that atrium to draw the air up. At Limberlost, we're in the heart of the city. We wanted the students to interact with the city. We wanted them to see out. We didn't want an interior atrium to look inwards. We wanted to look outwards. So on the east and west side of the building, on the exterior, we have about a 1.5 meter wide chamber rising from level 2 all the way up to the roof, with heat shelves in the chimneys. When the air heats up, it draws the air up through the openings up at the top, the outlets. But it only does that when the exterior windows are open. So the windows in the classroom can be opened. Air moves through the classroom through acoustically transfer grills that then bring the air into the corridor. And I say acoustically transfer grills because noise shouldn't get through, but air can. So they're a very sophisticated, but also simple design using just like insulation in chevron shape. So we bring the air through that grill into the corridors, into what we call breathing rooms. It makes its way into the solar chimney and then rises up through the building. And the solar chimney I'd say that the exterior, the envelope of this building is the most complicated mechanical system on the project. I've never worked on a project where the envelope is more complicated than the mechanical system.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised by you saying that. Like the envelope itself you're right. The envelope itself is part of the mechanical system in the building. And it's not just sheltering you from the elements, it's actually working with the elements.
That's right.
Interesting.
So you could have level 3, maybe half occupied, level 7, fully occupied, a few scattering people on other floors, so that every floor is working with the air volumes and the pressures in the building to draw that air through. The solar chimneys are modulated with power operated windows that open and close in order to allow that air to move through in a comfortable way so you don't really feel that breeze going past you. And they also act as blankets on the building. In the summertime, when you're in cooling mode, you don't want those to be hot. Like we call them a solar chimney. It makes it sound like they're warming there. But we have windows on the outside. So in the summer, we open those windows and allow air to flush through that chimney, creating like a cold blanket on those facades. And the opposite happens in the winter. We button those down. We allow the heat to build up, and it creates warm blankets on the east and west side of the building.
I guess there are 2 questions. One is, do you see a role for mass timber in mainstream construction of projects? Like right now, I don't want to say numbers because I'm definitely going to get it wrong. But let's say if it's 5% of or 2% of the entire Toronto market is being built with mass timber, do you see a foreseeable future that it is going to be 30% mass timber, or is it always going to be a niche product minority? That's one question. And the other question would be, what is stopping that?
I don't know if I have the right answer for that about the percentage and where it's going to go, but if I can make a prediction, what makes something niche? What makes something mainstream? And I think something is considered mainstream when in terms of architecture and construction, when the contractors understand how to work with it and there's knowledge there, when the consultant team, the design team has a deep understanding, when the manufacturing facilities they have local producers of that product, when owners are asking for it, it has to be the full package. It is, maybe now it's still considered niche, or I say now it's niche, but I think we're moving outside of that. We have clients coming to us saying we want a mass timber structure because we know it creates a better environment for our staff or the residents. We know it can be built faster, and we know it's local. The materials come from a local source. We're also what the other aspect that pulls it out of mainstream is when you have different building typologies starting to build with mass timber. The easy low-hanging fruit was the residential and office. Those are in the building code. Those are relatively simple buildings to build, small occupancies. It's when you start getting into the A2 assembly occupancies, it becomes more difficult. It's a stricter part of the code. So we're now seeing warehouses. Prologis is building a warehouse, mass timber warehouse in Brampton. There's a fire station. I think the fire station, it's east of Toronto. There's a fire hall being built. TDSB is building schools. We're building post-secondary government facilities. The federal government's building, not to mention codes are changing. So the codes are seeing this technology and this building typology come on board. Like, look at Vancouver. They have a climate emergency action plan. So they now have embodied carbon targets. When you submit for a building permit, you have to calculate your full life cycle embodied carbon, compare that to what an equivalent building is. You have to meet a certain target. So when you build with mass timber, you pretty much get there immediately. So it's pushing mass timber. Also in Vancouver, one other municipal change they've made is if you build, or a zoning change, if you are going to build a tower with mass timber, they'll give you 2 additional stories. So normally you have to go for rezoning or you have to go to committee. They're probably going to give it to you anyways, but at huge cost. So now you're saying you're building mass timber, we'll give you 2 stories. So that changes the equation. So when things like that start happening,
incentive.
So they wouldn't do that if it's a niche market. Not many people are building it. They're encouraging it. It's part of the climate action plan around the world. The biggest uptake in mass timber may be in China. They have extreme fight. I think 40 to 50% of the world's population lives in that region: China, India, Bangladesh, that whole region.
Yeah.
And they know they have a problem. The air is dirty. The fossil fuels that they're burning is extreme. And mass timber is a solution that they've latched onto, saying that this will change the narrative, because it accounts for 40% of the world's greenhouse gases. Your structure is 30% of the volume of the building. So if you can build with mass timber, you've solved 30% of the problem, and you've taken a big dent out of that 40% carbon emissions. The world is seeing it. We're seeing it in all over Australia, South America, big uptake in mass timber in Brazil, all over the United States. Houston is a hotbed for mass timber right now. Toronto is a huge hotbed right now. Like, we're really catching up. I could go on talking about this forever. Hochschlasser out of Austria just invested a ton of money in Element 5 in St. Thomas, Ontario, to build a state-of-the-art glue lamp factory. So the factories are here. The technical knowledge is here. Contractors know how to build with it. Trinity College residents. It was their very first mass timber building, and they're flying. They're beating their targets. They're on schedule. They're loving it. The contractors love working with it, and everyone that works in the mass timber building, they want to do more. They get excited about it. They love being a part of it.
Yeah, that's true. And like I mentioned, I've had the opportunity and the privilege of being part of a couple of these projects, which hopefully going to come to fruition not too far in the future. But at the same time, I agree with you that a lot of institutional money is flowing that way. And it's creating knowledge. I agree with you 100% that us as professionals in the industry feeling comfortable taking on a mass timber project is a very big part of promoting it. If you go to an architect and they just scared and want to shy away from touching anything that looks new like that, then that's never going to help the cause. That's never going to cause. But what you guys did at Limberlost, like you said, 250 tours of 10 people, that's 2,500 people who walked that building with you or your colleagues. That's a very decent number for a city of our size. And yeah, like it sounds promising.
Okay.
So I want to try and wrap up the conversation here, but it's been very fruitful. But let me ask you this. Is there any technological improvement, innovation, trend out there that you personally feel excited and say, you know what, I can't wait to try that new technology on the next project?
Yes, there's a couple that come to mind, but one I think I should focus on is the concept of prefab. So, well, mass timber in itself is a prefabricated system, but we don't want to stop there because the beauty of prefabrication is these elements get built in a factory in an environment that's safe. It's on the floor. It's in a tempered environment. You're not dealing with the elements and building in freezing cold weather, and so the quality assurance becomes right up is a primary aspect that makes it successful. So we experimented with this at Limberlost. The exterior wall panels are prefabricated. This is a full prefabricated wall panel. They arrive on site with the full backbone, the sheathing, air barrier insulation on thermal clips, cladding on thermal clips, windows glazed. It's a gasketed system. And because it's built in a factory setting, we are expecting a very tight envelope. The air changes per hour to meet passive house is 0.6 air changes per hour. We're testing with ULC tested panels are 0.09 air changes per hour. You can't get that with a site-built system. But prefabricated panels, it's becoming such like we struggled with it at Limberlost because there weren't many manufacturers. We ended up going with CGI out of Windsor. They're a local firm. They had the technology to do it, but they haven't really done anything to the scale of Limberlost. A lot of trials and errors and lessons learned there. But since then, we have Unity Wall has come to the forefront. Element 5 has a system called the clip panel, cross-laminated insulation panel, I think it stands for. The Flynn has the Speedwall system, which is being used in a project in Vancouver right now.
Yep.
There's so many on the market. So let's not even stop there. Let's look at volumetric prefab. That's common in Europe. You're seeing, especially in like hoteling, student residences, where they actually build the whole unit. They bring that entire volume, essentially land that element. They connect the mechanical systems, electrical systems, and your unit is built. There's Intelligent City, which I know you know a lot about, and they're trying to do something similar to that. So that technology is coming. I would love to learn more about Intelligent City. We need to see that type of innovation happen all over.
Buildings it is a very innovative product. Yes.
So innovative. It's going to be built cheaper, faster, better, with resiliency built in. It's so exciting. And I can't wait to see that hit the Toronto market.
That's pretty good. Thank you very much, Phil. I very much appreciate your time and sharing your experience and trade secrets, some of them, as you mentioned, with us. This has been a pleasure, this whole journey. You and I have gone through a few things together, multiple discussions, always very informative, enjoyable. And thank you for doing this.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.